Oh yeah, I bet I could do all that stuff. Let's see if anybody needs some advice on the internet. Here's a guy. Car not running right. Oh yeah, let's see. Hey, recently unemployed father of 3. I know a lot about cars, and I'd say the problem with your car is with the ignition. I'd say change the plugs and wires on it, but since your money's very tight right now, it would be smarter to just change the plugs since they're cheaper. And if that doesn't work, then change the wires since they're more expensive. If it still doesn't work, I'd say you probably need a new ignition coil, but that would suck because I hear they're real expensive. If that doesn't fix it, I don't know what's wrong. But a lot of people say to change the O2 sensor because that can cause a lot of problems. But I agree you should fix it yourself so that you don't throw a lot of money at the car and waste money you don't have. Alright. Oh, Scotty's got a new video out. Sweet!
That is what I'm talking about. Innocent and harmless? Hardly do I think so, because you have to keep in mind that people without any automotive knowledge that are asking for help have no foundation on which to differentiate people who give good advice from bad advice. And because the internet is full of the Haynes Manual jockeys that will freely give their 2 cents worth because they have nothing to lose, then people can suffer from it and start wasting all of their hard-earned money or money they don't have, especially when they're in a desperate situation. Thus my reason for such disregard for that type of behavior. If you don't believe it's epidemic, I dare you to pause this channel, head over to Yahoo Answers on the Yahoo search engine, go to the automotive section, and if you think that's a reliable place to get your automotive information, trust me, you'll be right back here. Yes, I guess it's going to be another one of those angry videos since I've been gone all week. I only have this Saturday, and then I head back for another week out of town tomorrow. So I decided during that time today I'm going to squeeze in a video because I had lots of time last week at the hotel to catch up on comments and emails. And we're going to squeeze out a quick video here on a couple of topics. First of all, some really good questions and comments that were brought up on the previous videos in the series. And then hopefully if we have time, we're going to go ahead and look at the cylinder head on this truck and see if it fits within specifications. So that's the goal today. So the first question that I should have pointed out earlier is very obvious. Why am I doing this rebuild in the first place when the whole point of the video seems to be that rebuilding an engine on a budget is a waste of time? And there's 2 answers to that. The best answer actually was given in a comment by one of my subscribers, DJ Devon3, with a very amazingly, almost eerily astute observation that the only reason I must be doing this is because I am friends with the owner of this truck and the truck has a sentimental attachment. Actually, he has a sentimental attachment to the truck. Maybe it is reciprocated, I don't know. But that is amazing, Devin, because that is absolutely exactly why I am doing this. It is a friend of mine who has an attachment to the truck, and it seemed like the only option that we could find was taking a chance on a rebuild and seeing if we could stay within budget. Now, that said, another reason is it actually is possible to do this on a budget of under 500 bucks. I know I have done it myself twice. The best example is the Ford F-250 that I used to own when I did this a lot more often and I was in St. Louis, and I needed just a truck to get me to and fro from the junkyard, mostly hauling engines and transmissions and things, sometimes towing cars and whatnot. And I bought the truck for obviously a very, very low price because it had some issues, but it did run fine. It didn't have engine knock, anything, little low compression. Lots of oil leaks. And when I did this dissection on the truck, because I wanted it to be reliable, every single thing turned out to be within spec. And basically all I did was just do a re-ring, complete bearing set, and every gasket in the engine, valve seals, rear and front main seals. And that truck ran amazing for many, many, many tens of thousands of miles for years. Even a friend of mine borrowed it to drive up to New York, tow a car back. I eventually, when I moved to Colorado, sold the truck to a person that had a snowplow business. And so you absolutely, definitely can do this work on an amazing budget, but in all reality, the engine has to not be in a catastrophic failure to begin with. If you're at a point where you are suspecting you need a rebuild, the chances are that your starting point is going to be $1,500. So those are two answers to that question. And another really good question, and it wasn't really so much a question as it was many people that made the same comment. And that comment was that they felt that I made a rather egregious logic error in my diagnostic approach to show that this engine is out of spec as far as the bore diameter. And it actually turns out to be that they are absolutely 100% correct. I did make a mistake on that. See, I do take criticism, but it has to be logical, and I don't respond well to the grammar police and things like that. But let me show you exactly the mistake that was pointed out that I made. And actually, there's more information than what I showed in the video, but absolutely, I'm not making excuses. Based on the information I gave in the video, I came to an illogical conclusion. So in the previous video, I had mentioned I do not own a dial bore indicator gauge, so I had no way of directly measuring the bore diameter to see if it was in spec. So what I opted to do instead was to use the piston and the feeler gauge, and by checking the piston to bore clearance, like this with the feeler gauge, I was able to determine that the piston to bore clearance is more than double out of the minimum tolerance, and therefore the bore diameter must be considerably out of tolerance from the 4-inch spec, therefore needing extensive machine shop work and dooming this engine block based on our budget. So the logic error I made, I did not account for a variable. There was actually another variable besides the bore diameter that was not considered. Actually, technically there's two variables, but nobody caught the second one, although it's kind of dismissible. That variable is, it is entirely possible that the piston is out of specification with its diameter. In other words, it may be that the diameter on this bore is exactly 4.00000 inches, but the piston is worn down and therefore a smaller diameter. So when I measure with my gauge, I am incorrectly crediting the bore for being out of diameter when it is actually the piston. Very, very astute, my viewers, and I'm willing to admit that in the video I did not show that properly. So it is indeed a valid consideration, and I messed up. The other variable, by the way, it is also possible that my indicator gauges were inaccurate. But, all right. 3 thousandths, 3 thousandths, let's see, 0.25, 0.25. All right, well, we've ruled that out, or both of my indicator gauges are identically out of calibration. All right, and obviously, while that technically is a consideration, it is so infinitesimally minuscule, the odds that both of my gauges are identically out of specification, that we're just going to go ahead and accept that it is an established fact that my measurement devices are accurate. But it is a very good point about the piston. So there are several ways that I need to address that to prove that this engine is nothing more than a paperweight. Ooh, I forgot. There's a sentimental attachment to this engine. Sorry about that. But what we're going to do is several things. First of all, I'm going to give an explanation on why I kind of dismissed the piston as an issue. And that is, you have to remember, let me get a piston with some rings on it. You have to remember that the piston has the rings on it. And my logic here is that the rings are going to buffer the piston so that the piston actually is not going to wear along the walls. The rings will wear, and they do, but it is highly unlikely, given the diameter of these rings, that the piston itself is going to wear down. More likely it is going to be the bore to do it, but that is not conclusive evidence. I absolutely concur. So my other rationale for this method, which I didn't mention before, and I probably shouldn't mention now because it's actually irrational, but it is the fact that I have measured many engines with this method, and this is actually the first engine I have ever come across where the piston to bore clearance was out of spec by any amount, especially by that much. Now, of course, on a channel where the whole point of this is the scientific method of diagnosis, where you have to make a procedure where your evidence can only possibly result in one conclusion, we cannot use that as evidence because it is the logic fallacy of argumentum ad antiquitatem, which is the argument that because something has always worked in the past, it has worked this time. So I'm well aware of that, so we'll dismiss that as well. But there is another thing too, and it's maybe a little bit subjective. There are two of them actually. One of them, and I couldn't really show on camera, but for those of you that are somewhat familiar with this, you know that there will be cross hash marks in the cylinder bore from the honing process. And even on an engine with quite a number of miles, you'll still see some trace of those hash marks. And there is no evidence of honing marks whatsoever in this engine. You just see kind of at best a bunch of straight up and down lines. But again, indicating that there clearly must have been some cylinder bore wear. But again, not conclusive that it is to the point it is out of spec. And another one is that if you drag your finger up and down the cylinder bore to the points where the ring travel stops, you can absolutely feel a rather significant lip. And it's not carbon, it's below the carbon ring that would normally form. But again, that is subjective. I would have to measure that lip and show that it is out of spec. So there's really actually, to be scientific and logical about it, only two ways that I can prove that this engine is indeed a big giant paperweight. The one method would be if I measure the piston and show that the piston diameter is within spec. If the piston diameter is within spec and the piston to bore clearance is out of spec, only the bore can be out of spec. So, logical. There's a second way too. I would have to directly measure the bore. And of course, as I said, I do not have a dial indicator bore gauge, but actually, it was the same guy that made the observation about the sentimental attachment to the truck must be a reason that I'm doing this. He basically emailed me and said, dude, it's time to get a bore indicator gauge. Devin, I agree with you 100%. So while I was on my trip, I noticed from my hotel, just a couple blocks away, were a few pawn shops. Obviously, maybe I didn't do the best job of selecting my hotel location, I guess. But anyway, I did finally go ahead, and while the dial indicators were rather pricey and not something I was willing to spend, I did go ahead and drop 50 bucks on a telescopic gauge set. So the thing with this gauge set is it's going to add one more level of measurement than a dial indicator would. So I'll have to measure the bore with my telescopic gauge and then measure the telescopic gauge using my calipers. But I believe this is going to be plenty accurate enough given the amount of slop I expect to find to show that the bore is going to be comfortably out of spec. So let's do this one at a time. All right, and admittedly, maybe this isn't the best tool for measuring a large thing like a piston here. But if I can get to the largest diameter on this thing, it looks like it's right there. We've got 3.9975, it looks like there. All right, I just want to take another measurement just to kind of get an average here. Yeah, that's going to be the highest point there. and we've got 3.9980 almost exactly. So let's think about that. So it turns out that the spec sheet does not have a specification for diameter of the piston, so that kind of sucks, but we can still mathematically calculate it. At 3.9980, you've got 2 thousandths allowance then with a 4-inch bore, which seems like it would be the spec. The bore does have a range on the spec up to 4.002 inches, so the trouble is at measuring more than 5 thousandths of slop with my feeler gauge, there is really very little doubt about it. The piston at 3.9980 is certainly going to be within its spec, but the bore diameter cannot be. But that's okay. Now that I've got a dial bore gauge, we can just go ahead and measure the bore diameter. So let's just go ahead and end this thing definitively by going ahead and using my special little toy here. And I think we're going to go ahead and pump 2 to the chest and 1 to the head into this thing, pretty much the same way the Obama Messiah did to bin Laden 3 years after his campaign promise to negotiate with terrorist countries rather than use military force. So the way this works is pretty simple. It's got these little springies on the end that you can secure into position with this little lock. And when you put this into the bore and find the maximum diameter, you can lock that position so it holds in place, and then you just can simply measure that with your dial indicator. So one of the things is that I kind of ran into a little bit of an issue here. I decided to practice this once before I go on camera, and I found that I have learned there is very valid reason why you want to have a dial on this thing. It's not so much for the convenience of a direct measurement. It turns out that it's very hard to find your center point because the dial would help you to find the largest area on your x-axis and your smallest area on your y, or I guess it would be a z. So in other words, to exaggerate it, if I measure here, there is a vast difference than if I measure in the center. So I have to make sure that the gauge is centered this way, but also on the depth, there is a vast difference if I tilt the gauge versus having it centered, where I'd get a much smaller measurement. So that is a problem, because I'm not sure how I'm going to make sure that I'm perfectly square in the bore, except I actually do have an idea right here. Remember this trick to square the ring? So let's do that. Let me go ahead and get that in there. Get a piston with a stop on it. And let's make sure this is up near the top. And what this is going to do is square the ring in there. Perfect. So that I know that at least on my depth, on my z-axis, I will be square to the bore, and then I only have to worry about my xy axis. Wile E. Coyote, super genius. Let's see how this works. Ah, perfect. So now I know that the gauge is centered as far as the depth goes. So that's a dramatic difference. And now it's a matter of just getting it into the center here. But it's definitely squared on the depth. That actually worked out really well. So it turns out that actually it's easier to do this way because you can feel a resistance. So it's pretty easy for me to do this, because if I kind of exaggerate and I go here and lock it, then of course there's going to be slop when I'm at the highest point. However, if I'm at the highest point, which you actually, believe it or not, can feel pretty comfortably, it almost centers itself, and I lock that, then I shouldn't be able to move the gauge back and forth. So let's get that highest center point there and lock that. And that is locked in there, so I can measure this distance, and that should be the bore diameter. Now, granted, there are some margins of error involved not only with this measurement, but the fact that I'm also going to measure it with my dial caliper. So what I'm going to have to do is take an average of maybe 5 or 6 measurements to make sure that I'm accurate. On my first measurement, and it's a little bit tricky, I admit, because there's rounded ends on the telescopes here to make sure that, of course, it kind of hugs the curve there. But what I'm getting here, I've got 4.0135, and that's not 4.00135, but actually 4.0135, so a considerable amount out of spec. Now, of course, I've got to take an average of several measurements, so I'm going to go ahead and do this again and see what I get. All right, well, I have measured this thing 5 times, and I can tell you that I have not got any readings below 4.01 inches. And there does seem to be a little bit of a difference whether I measure a little bit more on an x-axis versus a y-axis, indicating there may be a little bit of oval shape on the cylinder or out of round. But the bottom line is that either, and I'm only varying by maybe a couple thousandths of an inch at the very most, not even that, but less than 0.02 of an inch. So either this cylinder is tremendously out of specification, or I am incredibly precise but horribly accurate at measuring the exact diameter. But I can assure you that even if I was terrible at centering this thing exactly, I'm not going to be off by nearly that much. We can also actually now, given that information, validate my original test. And that is because we are 8 thousandths out of specification. Remember, I knew that I was more than 5 thousandths, but I never actually maxed out what I measured to be the maximum piston to bore clearance, and we can now estimate that it's going to be around 8 thousandths. It's going to be pretty close. So let's go ahead and put that to the test with an 8 thousandths gauge and see how the piston fits. All right, 8 thousandths gauge, and we're going to do my original test here, and we can see that we do get some drag there. So all the math works out. That cylinder bore is out of spec. QED. But I will tell you, looking back, I kind of regret not maybe investing a little more in one of these things that has the dial on it. I did not realize that the dial serves more of a purpose than saving a measuring step. But still, these do work once you kind of get the hang of them. And thanks, Devin, for talking me into this. I will admit I was a little worried. I would have been better off taking my $50 bill and rolling it up to the size of the diameter in the bore, cutting it and measuring it. But it turns out that this is actually a really good investment. But very important, I want to point out that in no way can I say that, haha, I was right, and the people that said that I was wrong about my measurements and that the bore could be within spec are wrong. That is actually quite the opposite. The people that said that I did this incorrectly, or showed it incorrectly at least, are absolutely correct. And even though it turns out that the bore is indeed, as I said, out of spec, I was wrong. I absolutely did make an error in the last video showing the procedure where I concluded the bore must be out of spec. There is no question about it. I was wrong. You guys were right. And it's very important, I think, to understand this concept that in a scientific, rational approach, which is the whole point on the channel, your procedure is everything. It is absolutely everything, because while people may argue about did you get the data right, or is the data accurate and everything, or even interpretation of the data, the idea is that nobody with a rational, logical mind can argue with the procedure. It's like a logical argument in a way. So the idea is you have to get the data in such a meticulous manner where there can only be one variable, and the data has to conclusively necessitate that only that variable can be your explanation. And if you have more than one variable, then you failed, at least scientifically and logically. So it's not the end result that, I said that the bore was out of specification and it turns out it is. It's kind of like if somebody asks, what's 2 plus 2? And I say, 2 plus 2, that would be the same as 6 times 6, so it would be 4. And the thing is, even though I came up with the true answer, the way that I approached it is irrational and illogical. And that's kind of what I did in the last video because I had more than one variable. So I think it's really important to understand that there are, I believe, an awful lot of people actually that are just, I guess they're just not wired that way or something where they just don't get it. They don't see that. And there's a lot of people that would look at the evidence on this and go, well, I just don't understand how that absolutely guarantees that that bore is out of spec. Or even worse, there would be people that just go, well, I still believe that the bore is in spec. But it can be frustrating because people a lot of times don't get it. But for those of you that do, my suggestion is there is a lot more to life than rebuilding engines and fixing cars. If you have that scientific mindset, apply that to everything. Your financial decisions, important decisions about your career, your family, your medical care. Is your doctor, when he says you have a certain diagnosis, is he coming up with that diagnosis because there is only that one possible conclusion from the test that he did? Question that. Things you read in the news, this is bad for you, this is good for you, your political viewpoints, whatever. People can always argue again about the data and the collection and if it's accurate and stuff, but the procedure will universally be agreed upon by people who are logical and rational. And just know that, again, there's a lot of people that aren't like that. And to be honest with you, people that react emotionally, to get their conclusions instead of think rationally, or they come to conclusions based on what makes them feel better, or what they've done in the past, or how they were raised, or what other people and their peers do. Just know that if you take my advice, unfortunately, those people are going to really think you're a dick. But to be honest with you, I'm okay with that. Maybe it's just me, but I would rather acknowledge an absolute truth that is undesirable rather than live in an ignorant bliss. But that's just me. So anyway, hey, enough of this philosophizing. It's time for head.